where they were getting so-called anti-gravity effects. And if you go back to the early 1900s, 1902, you have Tesla and Stubblefield that had an Earth battery that was taking the electromagnetic differential between the charge of the Earth inside the Earth's soil and the air to pick up an electromagnetic charge and to run a generator. These sorts of things have been done by people thousands of times over the last 100 years, and so it's not as exotic as something that's interstellar. It's even these sorts of electromagnetic systems that are. But now, the secrecy around those sort of technologies is identical to the UFO issue because it still opens this can of worms of a way to run the world without the Goldman Sachs and the central banks and the oil companies all running the show.
Sure.
But I think that it's two sides of the same coin. When you talk about free energy and new energy and the UFO secrecy, it's really all part of the same issue, frankly. Although there's an added dimension when you deal with the ET issue because of the theological implications. But I think we have to understand that the sciences and technologies are already in existence. We have done about 12 years of research. Dr. Ted Loder, who's a university professor, who's on our board, and a number of other people like Dr. Tom Bearden, who's a physicist and a lieutenant colonel retired from the U.S. Army. We've put together the documents, and we put together the science and the research so that a team of people adequately in a properly equipped lab brought together, and I mean not hundreds of people, but maybe a dozen scientists, and physicists, and electromagnetic engineers, and what have you, would be able to come up with something, I believe, within 1 to 2 years that would completely replace the internal combustion engine, oil, gas, coal, and nuclear power. Now, you would think that with that kind of information, people would be lunging at the opportunity to provide $3 or $4 or $5 million to get a lab up and going to do this.
Sure.
But that has not happened, and part of the reason for it is that some of the people who have been interested in that have told us that they're afraid that there'll be reprisals if they do. I think that it would be easier if there were 100,000 people who each gave $50 to the Orion project. You see what I'm saying?
Yep.
But that requires people taking an interest in networking this because it's much more likely you can get 100,000 people to do $50 apiece as a contribution to open this laboratory than you're going to have one person write a check of that amount. Because if they're that wealthy, it's also possible that they might be approached and be warned away from doing it. We just had this happen, by the way. I have to say, one of the tragedies of the last 30 days that you don't know about, but I'm going to talk about it here as well, is that we had 3 scientists who were top secret scientists who had agreed to bring out these technologies with us, who've actually built these things. Okay. I mean, I'm talking about folks who've done work for all the 3-letter agencies, if you get my drift. And we've been meeting with them for a couple of years. One of them we actually had under contract to start doing some research and development for us. And all 3 of these scientists were, within a 30-day period, threatened. And one of them was actually visited by a former CIA director and warned off from proceeding and helping us do this. So the kind of, this sounds like a conspiracy theory. It is not. We have this documented in a file. We're not going to go into it publicly at this point, but if anything were to happen to my team, it would hit the internet, frankly. It's in what we call a dead man switch. And if anything happens to me or my team, all these documents hit the internet, including the name of this former CIA director who's been interfering with this effort. But, these kind of scientists they're brilliant, but they're not people who are leaders. They've been cogs in a big machine, and their pensions are dependent on that machine, and everything else. And so what the public has to understand is that the OrionProject.org, as well as DisclosureProject.org, has got to have the support of the public in order to proceed. We've kind of gone as far as we can. Dr. Jan Bravo, who's on our board of the OrionProject.org, has donated hundreds of thousands of dollars and has done enormous work. She's recently retired from her medical career. She's also an emergency doctor like I am, to work full-time with me. But, we've sort of reached the limit of what we can do as just little individuals because we're not rich and powerful people. But what we have found is that if the public were to get involved and network these ideas to the right people,
right.
I think rather quickly we could get the funding in place to do this. And on top of it, people need to understand, there are three big projects we're doing: disclosureproject.org, the orionproject.org, and cseti.org. And everyone can learn how to do these techniques to make contact and basically bypass the stranglehold of Majestic in terms of contacting these civilizations. Now, what you have to understand is that the way that contact might proceed is pretty strange. J. Allen Hynek coined the term high strangeness, and then if you look at we put out a book this October called Contact, Countdown to Transformation, and with it, if you order it on disclosureproject.org, it actually has a DVD of some of the really strange images of craft and things that have appeared right near our contact groups.
Mm-hmm.
And people are going to be pretty amazed because it isn't quite out of Hollywood. It's more bizarre than that. And what you're dealing with are civilizations, because they go faster than the speed of light, can be superimposed in space-time right over your house or right in your backyard. You won't see it with the naked eye, but there'll be all kinds of strange electromagnetic effects that'll start happening. And so while we have had these craft fully materialize, they do it very briefly, I think, because usually, for example, last time we had a craft fully materialize in England, the hillside above which it appeared was swarming with helicopters and jets within about 10 or 15 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
So these things are picked up by satellite systems, and it becomes a rather dangerous situation. But there are other ways that they can make contact where they sort of stay beyond the crossing point of light, the veil of light, as it were, in these trans-dimensional forms. And this gets into the whole discussion of if you speed up a spacecraft and everyone in it beyond the speed of light, what is that? What form is that in?
Yeah.
And this gets into some rather odd stuff. It almost becomes shamanic, but in terms of the discussion. And this is where you have to have a deep understanding of consciousness and what I call the ancient Vedic tradition of siddhis, the siddhis, these strange ways that forms appear and dematerialize and rematerialize, because any civilization that goes faster than the speed of light, a priori, by definition, are not going to be using 21st century Earth sort of technologies.
Right.
Their communication systems have to go faster than the speed of light, and so do their transportation systems. And so you start dealing with a whole multiverse, as it were, of trans-dimensional, interdimensional reality. And this is what we teach people in these contact events. And it's not that hard to understand. It's something everyone should have known by the 1950s. But again, this information has been suppressed both by religious leaders as well as scientific leaders, because they want the people just to be ignorant of these things. And through their ignorance and fear, they can control them.
Absolutely. Stephen, I have a final question that I want to run by you as well before we wrap things up here for this time. And again, it actually goes back to this question of the aliens and how we know that they are benevolent. If we look at it from a different perspective, some might argue that we're looking at a slow colonization of sort. If we talk, for instance, about some of the research, like people from David Jacobs to Bud Hopkins and other abductees as well. The question there is, how would you approach that material? Would you say that, no, that actually is being run by a human group that are trying to portray the aliens as bad guys and are simulating these horrific abduction experiences? Or what do you think we're looking at there in terms of another point of view to this whole question?
Well, I don't think it's that simple. I think it's a mixed bag. For example, we know there are people who have had contact with ETs who then subsequently are targeted with military intelligence weapon systems that simulate these so-called abductions. For example, I know people who have been on abduction squads who are special forces and Army Ranger people that I know who have committed these horrible abduction acts. And people think that they are ET or alien, and they're not. For example, there's a man named Stan Romanek who I visited about 2 years ago out at his home in Denver, in a Denver suburb. And he has a videotape of this thing that looks like a gray, like you hear about from Whitley Strieber and Bud Hopkins and all those folks.
Right.
And his father had been an Air Force officer. And he had passed away, but apparently had some friends still in the military looking out for Stan Romanek. And when these events started happening, he started getting phone calls